So how does a simple disagreement over things like taxes and land explode into a full-blown revolution? Well, today we're going to get into it. We're going to unpack the wild 24 hours that basically lit the fuse for the American Revolutionary War, turning years of simmering tension into the shot heard round the world.
And believe me, the stakes could not have been higher. I mean, just a few weeks before the first shots were fired, a Virginia delegate named Patrick Henry stood up and just perfectly captured the mood with these words. This wasn't just some political debate anymore. For a lot of people, it had become a real choice: freedom or death.
But look, this explosion of violence didn't just come out of thin air, not at all. It was the result of over 10 years of growing frustration and anger, really starting right after Britain won the 7 Years' War. Those seeds of rebellion, they were planted in arguments over land, power, and, of course, taxes.
And really, this slide boils it all down. You've got two completely different ways of looking at the world. On one side, you have Britain, totally convinced that Parliament has every right to tax and rule the colonies. They see things like the Proclamation of 1763 as, just a smart way to keep the peace. But the colonists, they see it as tyranny. No taxation without representation becomes their rallying cry, and that proclamation? To them, it's just London stealing their chance to get cheap land out west. These two viewpoints just couldn't exist in the same space.
All that bad blood finally, and famously, boiled over in Boston Harbor. Think about it. Dumping 46 tons of tea into the ocean, that's not just a protest. That's a massive, expensive, and very public middle finger to British authority. And for the government back in London, that was it. That was the last straw.
So Britain decides it's time to lay down the law and make a brutal example out of Massachusetts. They pass a whole series of really harsh laws designed to completely crush the rebellious spirit in Boston. But, and this is a huge but, this plan is going to backfire spectacularly.
And you can see why the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. I mean, come on. First, they shut down Boston's port with a naval blockade, basically strangling their economy. Then, they get rid of the civilian governor and put a military general in charge. They gut the local government, say British troops can now be housed in private homes, and then, to top it all off, they pass the Quebec Act, which gives a bunch of land the colonists wanted over to Canada. This felt less like punishment and more like an occupation.
And this right here was Britain's biggest miscalculation. They thought that by punishing one colony so harshly, the others would get scared and fall in line. They completely misread the room. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts absolutely horrified the other 12 colonies. They looked at what was happening in Boston and thought, hey, that could be us next. And suddenly, a sense of unity was forged in the fire of resistance.
This new sense of unity led to something huge: the First Continental Congress. For the very first time, representatives from almost all the colonies got together in one room to figure out what to do. They organized a massive boycott of all British goods, and they sent one last petition to King George, basically saying, hey, we're still loyal, but you've got to fix these problems. And what did they get in return? Crickets. Total silence.
So when the king just completely ignored their final plea for peace, well, that was pretty much it. The door to any kind of reconciliation just slammed shut. With diplomacy totally dead and tensions at an absolute fever pitch, the crisis was about to move from the State House to the battlefield. The time for talking was officially over.
So General Gage, the British military governor, gets his orders straight from London. Disarm these rebels now. And his plan? It was a classic special ops mission. He'd send his troops out under the cover of darkness, march them quickly to Concord, and grab all the militia's guns and gunpowder before anyone even knew what was happening. Simple, right?
Wrong, because Boston was crawling with spies on both sides. The Patriots knew something was up, so the second those British troops started to move, riders like Paul Revere took off like a shot into the countryside, waking up every town and village with the warning, "The regulars are coming out." Just like that, the element of surprise was gone.
And so you have this incredibly tense scene. It's just before dawn on Lexington Green. A tiny group of about 80 colonial militiamen are standing there, facing down the most powerful army in the world. There's shouting, there's confusion, and then a single shot rings out. To this day, nobody knows for sure who fired it, but the British troops responded with a massive volley. When the gun smoke cleared, 8 Americans were dead. The war had begun.
The British pushed on to Concord, but by the time they got there, hundreds and hundreds of militiamen, the famous Minutemen, had arrived. At the town's North Bridge, the British troops, now way outnumbered, opened fire on the colonists. But this time was different. The Americans didn't run.
They stood their ground, they fired back, and they actually forced the British redcoats to fall back. It was a stunning moment.
And that march back to Boston, it turned into an absolute nightmare for the British. It was a 20-mile gauntlet of terror. Thousands of militiamen swarmed the route, taking shots from behind every tree, every stone wall, every farmhouse. It wasn't a retreat. It was a desperate running battle for survival.
The price of that single day was steep. While the Patriots took serious losses, the British Army got absolutely hammered, with nearly 250 men killed or wounded. For one of the most professional armies on the planet, this was a shocking and humiliating outcome. It proved the colonial militia was no joke.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to this quote from Lord Percy, the British commander who led the relief force. He said that anyone who thought of the colonists as just some irregular mob was going to be much mistaken. In just one day, the entire British perception of who they were fighting had changed.
The political fallout from Lexington and Concord was, to put it mildly, seismic. Everything had changed. What started as a political protest movement now had to transform into a full-scale war effort, and it had to do it fast.
Almost immediately, something incredible happened. From all over New England, militiamen just started showing up outside Boston. Within days, an army of 15,000 men had materialized, completely surrounding the city and trapping the entire British Army inside. A siege had begun.
So 3 weeks later, when the Second Continental Congress met, they walked in thinking they were going to be debating trade boycotts. Instead, they found themselves having to run a war. They weren't debating anymore. They were raising money for weapons, trying to find allies overseas, creating their own postal service, and, this is the big one, authorizing the creation of a brand new unified continental army. Okay, so you've created an army on paper. Great. But that brings up the million-dollar question, doesn't it? Who on earth is going to be brave enough, or maybe crazy enough, to lead this ragtag army against the most powerful military on the planet?
Well, the answer turned out to be a 43-year-old delegate from Virginia named George Washington. Now, he had real military experience from the French and Indian War, but just as importantly, he was a Virginian. Having a Southerner lead an army that was mostly made up of New Englanders at the time was a brilliant political move, a powerful symbol of unity. He was the unanimous choice.
And Washington himself was completely humbled by the task. He understood the awful choice that he and all the colonies were facing. He put it bluntly, it was a choice between a terrible, bloody war and a life of what he called slavery under British rule. For him, a virtuous person really had no choice at all, no matter how painful the path ahead.
Which leaves us with this final question to think about. Were the events of April 19, 1775 just a tragic, messy little skirmish? Or was that first anonymous shot fired in the half-light of dawn on Lexington Green truly the spark that would not only create a new nation, but would also ignite a fire of revolution that would literally change the entire world?